I have a BOC higher pattern on a peak that I am going to go over and show you the details of the conditions with the three gap patterns. If you recall, most of you know, maybe you haven't seen it before, but the three gap patterns are the identical indicators. We like to see 12 or more. We like to see down touches when we have a gap up, excuse me, and up touches when we have a gap down. And then, of course, in the proximity group, we have location patterns and shape patterns, and we look for those to be, I think the easiest way to describe it is to be in a normal position for the gap. That's not always true, but what I'm trying to say is that certain patterns or specific patterns will typically have certain places where the power 4 and the power Zion go to when the gap occurs, and usually 2 or 3 places generally when that specific pattern occurs and ends up in a gap. And so we think of the proximity group location patterns as being in a normal position, but there are exceptions. Now, in this particular example here, I've got a trend red in a BOC higher pattern on a peak, and this occurs typically. The BOC pattern occurs before the peak, and oftentimes when it is a BOC higher pattern, it occurs at the peak. Now, this is the highest peak that will occur oftentimes in the movement. What we have here is, again, if you're not familiar with how the system works, we always look at trend red first. We immediately glance at our 7 short-term trend lines. That would be the trend yellow, pink, and blue line, that trio that moves up and down, up and over 0 and down and under 0. And then we have the orange and green wide lines, which are the other group. And then on the swing chart, we have the red and the green. If I move this up higher, we can see the red and green lines. And those 3 groups identify the short-term trend, and we always want to know where the short-term trend is going. The trend trio moves faster than the other 2 groups, and so when we start to see a change in a cycle, we'll see it first in the trend trio lines. But remember, these 7 short-term trend lines are slower moving lines. They're not designed to pick up the pullbacks and the rallies. They're designed to show us which way the internal pressures are moving at that point in time. We have a blue dash line on the candle chart. It's not here right now at this minute because I've removed that, and I've also removed the Bollinger Band lines, the 2 yellow and pink lines, and the Zion line, 2 upper and lower Zion lines. So in any case, the master long-term trend is basically an exponential average that we created to identify the long-term trend. And traders do not use the long-term trend to trade, but they will use the short-term trend to trade. And we, again, if you're not familiar with it, we had probably 5 or 6 primary methods. We whittled it down to 3. We were trying to make one short-term trend line like we did with the long-term trend line, but that didn't work. And so we created 3 short-term trend line groups the trend group, the power group, and the swing group, 7 lines total, and those 7 represent the short-term movement within the stock. And this is the trend that traders want to know about. And then, of course, for rallies and pullbacks, we have, like on the trend chart with the fast lines, our trend red, green, and gray. And the red, green, and gray down touch the yellow, pink, and blue. They down touch the 0. They down touch underneath the 0. Those are the 5 down touches that occur in the trend chart when we're talking about a gap. The 6th one goes up, and we refer to it as a sky touch. And there are 5 positions in the sky touch. The day that trend red, for example, right here in this over here, we have trend red on this day here crossing over trend green. And that's officially the day of the uptrend in most people's mind. Some will say it's back here when trend red does a BOC pattern, and yes, that can be true. But in this particular case, as with the case of many times, the BOC pattern can be a weak start. And so we generally refer to the day that the trend red crosses over the green line. On the crossover day, that's referred to as day 0. And we then have 4 more days after that. 1 day after the crossover, 2, 3, 4 days after the crossover. Any of those 5 days, we can have a gap up. Now, with that information, we then look at what we've got here. In trend red, we had a BOC higher pattern, and in power, pink, yellow, and Zion, we had a BOC higher pattern. I'll have to move this back down again. You can see in swing yellow, we had a BOC higher pattern. In swing Zion, we had a BOC higher pattern. Swing Zion, in checking it earlier, is a BOC lower pattern. That's a price. Remember, Zion, Zip Pink, and the 3 price lines are price barometers, and they follow the price exactly. And in this case here, the swing Zion, the Zip Pink, and the 3 price lines are BOC lower patterns. I should verify that. I did not. I did it for the Zip Pink and the Zion, but price green there is 143.50, and on the vertical green line it's 142.75. So it's just a hair under, 3/4 of a point under the peak 2 days earlier. So all 5 price lines are BOC lower patterns, and the rest of the indicators are BOC higher patterns. And that's what we refer to as price divergence. And that is one piece of divergence that we've identified right here in the movement. And when we have divergence, we only need a couple of them, and then we usually have a pretty good gap. If you notice as well, over here, swing pink is going down instead of up. So that's a second piece of divergence. If we go over here to power red is down and trend red is up. That's a third piece of divergence. And so with that in mind, we have enough divergence there to identify with the fact that we highly suspect or anticipate that the day after this vertical green line, it will gap down. We had 5 gaps up in trend red, power pink, yellow, and Zion, and I think in swing yellow. then we had, or excuse me, we had four. Let me, I think it's four, or I think swing yellow is in a bottle. Let me look here. It's definitely higher, and I got to make sure the yellow line is down, so it is a BOC higher pattern. So the trend red, the swing yellow, and the power pink, yellow, and Zion are BOC higher patterns. And so those 5, along with the 5 price barometers, make 10 indicators that are BOC higher or lower patterns. Then we have in bottlenose up, we have trend green is a bottlenose up, power blue is a bottlenose up, and power white is a bottlenose up. So then we have 3 indicators in a bottlenose up pattern, and as you know, a bottlenose up is a pattern that tells us about a next day down. And so we have a total of 13 identical indicators in a 2-pattern group, 10 of them in a BOC pattern, and 3 of them in a bottlenose up pattern. Some might say we want to distinguish between a BOC and a BOC higher, BOC lower, BOC higher, but normally when we're dealing with gaps, we don't need to do that. We just need to look at the shape. Sometimes it's more critical, like for example, it has more power. If you're looking at a right leg W higher pattern and you have 18 or 20 right leg W higher patterns, you get more power in the gap if they're all higher patterns rather than some of them being right leg W lower patterns. So sometimes it makes a difference if they're all in one configuration, one shape configuration. Also, this if you look at this indicator here in trend red, so it's harder for some of us to look at gaps going down versus gaps going up. We need a down touch in the trend red chart, or excuse me, in the case of a gap down, we need an up touch. If you flipped this thing, if you flip trend red around and trend red was then the lowest, we would see trend red as a TOC lower pattern on a bottom, which again is divergent, just like the TOC higher pattern on a peak is divergent. A BOC pattern belongs at the bottom of a cycle, not at the top of a cycle. When it appears at the top, it is a divergent indicator by itself. And so, we might say we got 5 divergent indicators as well. But however you want to look at that, we have roughly 5 that are BOC higher and 5 that are BOC lower patterns. And now if you look at trend red upside down, so that trend red would be lowest, it would be in a TOC lower pattern. And it's easier to think of it possibly that way as a potential gap up, because the TOC pattern, lower pattern, when it pushed its way to the bottom, it had a lot of strength because the right leg was longer than the left leg. And so with that push to the bottom, the reaction next day is a push up. And in that case, it would be a gap up. In this case, we have the same thing, only in an inverse relationship. We have a BOC higher pattern, which means there's more force that was pushed up on this day, creating a reaction to push back the next day, causing the gap down. And so this is like a trend red is like a we have the 5 down touches. The trend red and green and gray can down touch the yellow, pink, and blue, or it can down touch 0, or it can go under 0. And the opposite is it can go above 0 or above the blue line. And so trend red is basically in an up touch above the blue line as we know it, and is the fifth, it's in that fifth category of an up touch within the trend chart. And so from a trend chart perspective, it qualifies as an up touch. Most of the time we like to see the crossover take place. In other words, red would cross over green and then go up. And if that was the case, then we would treat this day as day 1. The crossover day would be the bottom of this V, the day before the vertical green line. And at that point, if we had what we refer to as a normal crossover, trend red the day before would have been under green. It would have crossed over green and ended up right in the same spot it does on the day before the vertical green line, and then on the following day, which is day 1 after the crossover, it would then go up. We treat it as a crossover because it is in a BOC pattern. It's the opposite at the bottom of a cycle. We would treat a TOC as a crossover as well if that happened. Because remember, if you're looking at the fifth down touch, where trend red, if you're in a down touch where the yellow, pink, and blue are above 0, red crosses under 0. The day that it crosses under 0 is the signal for the turnaround and going back up the next day. Sometimes we have a second day in which red goes down the second day, but if it does, trend green will also cross under the 0 on the second day, and then both of them will go up or start the uptrend the following day. So the signal is the crossover. Day 1 is the red crosses over, and day 2, if red continues down, it's the green. If you should get caught in that, it usually doesn't go too far. You can wait for it, and or you can get out as far as that goes too, and then reinvest at the end of that day for the gap up the following day. But in this case, we have to think of it from the opposite perspective, and sometimes it's more difficult mentally to look at these things in the inverse than it is to look at them when things are going up. So we have, anyway, in trend red, we have what's referred to as a down touch under the blue line. Above the blue line. And so that's the up touch. That's what qualifies us for the up touch pattern. Also, we have another piece of divergence in that trend red and green are up and trend gray is down. And when that happens, that is a divergent condition, an inverse relationship, obviously. And one indicator line is telling you the price is going one way, and the other indicator line is telling you the price is going opposite. And so that creates divergence, which causes, when we have divergence, usually to get gaps, you only need 2 additional pieces of divergence. And right now, you can see we've got many. The BOC higher and BOC lower patterns are divergent. I mean, that was number 1. And in any case, moving on to the proximity location patterns, because that would be the third group of the gap up patterns or gap down patterns, we find that the power 4, pink, blue, white, and yellow, and Zion, so that's the power 5, are all above power orange line. And that's real typical for a gap down. Many many patterns will have that as one of their qualifying conditions in the location pattern of the power 5 for a gap down. Another one of those is the power 4 above power orange and power Zion under power orange, and then it gaps down. So again, there's 3 or 4, maybe 2 or 3 general patterns, general location patterns for each specific pattern that we have. But you know, all of those patterns can only fit within approximately, you know, well, there's 7 shapes, but there's probably a dozen or 15 conditions that constitute location patterns, because one of the things that causes additional patterns is that power yellow separates itself from the other 4 lines, pink, blue, white, and Zion. And so sometimes we'll get power yellow under orange and the other 4 above orange. And so there's another set of indicators that are in different locations by way of the power yellow line. So, and then the shape, of course, is our BOC higher pattern for the shape of the power 4. And again, we were in a 2 pattern group, 10 BOC patterns and 3 bottlenose patterns. So that all constituted a gap scenario. I'd like to point out over here in the zip chart, we had the zip line obviously did a BOC lower pattern, but zip Zion went up to 100 on this day, and it will often do that. Excuse me, I take that back. Zip Zion went up to 98 that day. It was above the pink. It'll usually go to 100, and when it hits that 100, then it goes right back down the next day. The Zip Zion climbing up and hitting green several days after green has been at 100. Then when Zip Green is at 100 and Zip Zion is at 98 or 99 or 100, then the following day everything starts going down. And that's what happened in this case. That particular, we call it a pinpoint top, where Zip Zion pinpoints at the top and starts back down. And that happens a lot. Of course, it doesn't happen every time, but it's a real good indication of that. Way over here on the end, we have a 1-day red-green twin peak. And that tomorrow, more than likely, that indicator or that value of that stock is going to go down, because a red-green twin peak is a indication of a next day down pattern. It could gap up and then go down, but without looking real closely, I don't see. There is quite a difference between Zion and pink. And we do have a possibility for a small gap up next day, because pink is right on the green and yellow red lines, and that could do us a gap up before we go down the next day. So there is double direction indications right now as I look at it. But Zip Zion is still only at 17, and it's running pretty flat. And of course you have the other indicators like price red and green are running flat. So it's hard to say at this point without going into it real deep. But that's what we have for for that particular indicator. It's a classic case of a downtrend, of a gap down, and the information is just there. It's just easy to see. You just need to know how to read it. It had all the qualifying requirements. We had 13 identical indicators in a 2-pattern group, a 10 and a 3. We had the uptouch in the trend red, that basically uptouched above the blue line, because remember it can up touch above the blue or above the 0 depending on where the trend trend blue, pink, and yellow lines are, the trend trio. And then of course we had our proximity group location all above the power orange, and we had the proximity shape patterns in the BOC higher pattern. So it all qualified there. We had plenty of divergence, and we had a pretty strong gap down. Classic, just basic reading of the indicators. Excellent, excellent example to see how they work.